Thank you for joining. We hope we can learn together about about the next elections. And I leave you with Nadia. Thank you, Nadia, for being here. You have her bio, but she's an activist, an educator, born in Argentina, currently living in Jerusalem for several years now, and of course, a wonderful member of the World Union of Progressive Zionists. So thank you, Nadia, for the session and for all that you do. And remember, everyone, you can leave your questions to Nadia, and we'll read them at the end of the Zoom. Thank you again for connecting.
Thank you, Kevin. And first of all, I want to thank everyone from the UPZ teams around the world that have made this possible and that organized this and that have shared the invitation to all of you. A little bit about how it's going to work. Basically, now I'm going to share my screen. I'll have a presentation and I'll do a more expositive part where I'm going to explain about the Israeli election system and the upcoming Israeli elections. I think it's safe to say that out of the 3 meetings, this will be the more the drier one, like more concrete information. And the next 2, we'll talk a little bit more about like the political context, analyzing the polls, what the results may be, coalition options, different things like that. So this will be a bit more of like direct information of how the system works and in general, what the options are for the upcoming elections. As Kevin said, you can leave your questions in the chat and he will be reading them to me at the end of the session. Just so you know that if you write a question, it's not that I'm actively ignoring you. It's just that first we're going to do more informative part and then we'll leave time for questions. Just if some of the team members can let me know if the subtitles and the translations are working okay. Yeah, we're good? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. Okay. If someone can if you can give me a thumbs up if you see my screen. Yeah, okay, perfect. So as I said, this is the first encounter where we're going to be talking about the Israeli political system and electoral process. So just to start us off, to talk about kind of what we're going to cover in this session, basically what the Knesset, the Israeli parliament is, and what it does, how do Israelis vote in the sense of how the system itself works, how votes translate or become seats within the Knesset, how the government is formed, because as we will see, it's not such direct system where votes are automatically translated to seats or to a government, why Israeli politics are often unstable or why sometimes coalitions are unstable, and what parties or options voters have in the 2026 elections. Okay, starting us off, we're going to talk about what a parliamentary democracy is. It might have similar points or different points to the systems you have in your different countries. Specifically, Israel is a parliamentary democracy. What that means is that citizens elect a parliament, what is known as the Knesset, and the government depends on the support of that parliament or being able to form a coalition. Basically, that means that Israelis are not directly electing their prime minister or their government ministries or a separate executive government. Basically, what they're doing is that they're electing the members of the Knesset, the people who will be part of the parliament. And after the election, the central question isn't just which party got the largest amount of votes, but which political leader within those elected can assemble a coalition that will give them at least 61 out of 120 Knesset members. They need the majority plus one, the half plus one to be able to reach a majority and form a government. Basically, the parliament and the government are 2 different institutions. So the Knesset is the legislative body that is chosen by the public, by the voters directly, and the government is the executive branch composed of the prime minister and the ministers that, as we said, are assigned after a coalition is formed. I will get obviously more into details on how that happens and what these different terms mean. but just in general explaining what a parliamentary democracy is. Basically, a party can be elected to the Knesset without joining the government itself. As we'll talk about a bit later, there is a coalition within the Knesset and an opposition within it. That means that parties can be elected to the Knesset and be part of the opposition towards the government. And because Israel doesn't have a constitutional structure, doesn't have a constitution, it has what is called the basic laws, or a collection of laws that are taken as a somewhat constitutional framework that define different things. Among those things that the basic law defines, we have how the Knesset works, how the elections work, how government is defined, and all of these things that we're going to see in this session are defined within the basic laws of the State of Israel. Basically, the relationship between what the government is, what the Knesset, the parliament is, the basic law system, and the Supreme Court has been an issue of a lot of controversy in the last couple of years, because the level of separation or non-separation between these different bodies is essential to the way democracy functions in Israel. And that's what has been up for a lot of debate, especially with the judicial overhaul that was presented in late 2022, beginning of 2023, if I'm not wrong. We'll get into that a bit later, but basically the division of those four different bodies is what today establishes democracy, basically. So that's in general about the system. What the Knesset is. The Knesset, as I said, is Israel's parliament. That's the name of it. It's unicameral, which means that Israel only has one parliamental chamber, different to a lower or an upper chamber or two separate chambers, as happens in many countries. And the Knesset has 120 members that are known as members of Knesset, or MKs. Basically, the number 120 and also the name Knesset come from a ancient tradition or ancient body that was the Knesset Agdola, or the Great Assembly, that dates back, if I'm not mistaken, to the second Beit HaMikdash, the second temple. There isn't actually a continuity, strictly speaking, between what was the ancient Knesset and the Knesset today, and the modern parliament. But the name and the number do honor that ancient tradition. The main functions of the Knesset, of the parliament, are basically passing laws, approving the government and its cabinet, supervising the government itself. It also elects the president of Israel, which work in separate elections. It elects the state comptroller, debates national policy, works through parliamentary committees that we'll get into a bit later. And also two other points that we'll talk about is that it can dissolve itself. The Knesset, the parliament, can dissolve itself and call for elections, or it can also replace or propose a replacement government through something that's called a constructive vote of non-confidence that we'll also get into a bit later. But in general, those are like the main functions of the parliament, pretty similar to any other parliament that we can find around the world. And as I said before, the Knesset is divided into committees. These committees work based on different topics. So we'll have committees dedicated, for example, to immigrants, dedicated to settlements, dedicated to reserve duties, different things that may come up. And basically, usually the main work of the Knesset happens within these committees and less in what is a larger plenum. Basically, the committees, based on the topic that is relevant to them, they have different functions. So they can examine proposed laws related to that topic. They can make amendments to laws or to propositions. They usually invite experts or representatives of the civil society to speak. So, for example, committees that have to do with life of students or welfare related to students will sometimes invite student body presidents or representatives to speak in their committees about these issues. They can also question ministers and officials, invite them to the debates to question them or to propose different things related to their work. They can also request government information from different ministries or governmental bodies. They can conduct a parliamentary oversight, and they can also investigate specific public issues, again, related to the topic that that specific committee is treating. And committee representation also generally reflects the strength of the different parties within the parliament. That being also the amount of representatives of a party that there is within a committee, but also who is guiding it, who is the head of the committee. And that obviously affects also what are the amendments or the proposals that come from this committee. That also being related to ideological coalitions or blocs that obviously change and reflect what those proposals will be. Okay, getting a bit more into what the basic electoral principles are. There are three main principles that we'll go through. Israel basically uses a nationwide proportional representation system that we'll talk about. So first of all, the whole country is one electoral district. This is it's very different from examples that we know around the world, but basically because Israel is a very small country, for national elections for the Knesset, for the parliament, it's taken as one electoral district. This is separate from local municipal elections that do exist within different cities or regions. But when we're talking about the Knesset, we're talking about one electoral body. That means that Israel is treated as one national constituency. That means that someone voting in Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, in Arad, in different cities and regions, basically participate in the same national calculation. That means that members of Knesset are not chosen to represent a region or a city, but the ideology of their list and their party. Sometimes that can be related also to the place where they're coming from, and we can talk about that as a separate topic, but basically it's quite different maybe from other countries where we do have at least one of the chambers within parliament where representatives are coming as representing their district. Here it's just one general electoral body. The second thing is that citizens vote for political parties. This means that citizens aren't voting directly for the prime minister or aren't voting for specific characters or political figures. They're voting for a closed list, and we'll get into how lists are built or what their composition is a bit later. But that means that they're not choosing an individual Knesset member, they're choosing a whole list. And then thirdly and lastly, seats are allocated proportionally. That means that a party, the number of seats a party will receive within the parliament is proportionate to the amount of votes they received. There is obviously a calculation of the votes divided by the 120 seats, and we'll get into that, but in general, it's proportionate. That means that a party that received approximately something like 10% of the total votes should have, therefore, about 10% of the seats within the Knesset. And those are like the three main principles. So we said Israel being one whole electoral district, citizens voting for a complete party and not individual members, and lastly, that the results are proportionate to the amount of votes received. A little bit, sorry, I'm going to go back for a second, a little bit about the historical origins of the Knesset, which will also kind of serve as a bridge to when we talk about why sometimes the coalitions are a bit unstable. Basically, this system of proportional voting and proportional representation that the Knesset adopted comes from what was taken by the Yishuv, or like the first settlements prior to the foundation of the State of Israel, where because we had mass migration from different countries, different Jewish ethnic groups, and different realities, the Yishuv, or the settlement, was organizing itself in a way that was allowing representation of the population to be as diverse as possible. That meant different ideologies, religious groups, immigration backgrounds, cultural communities, anyways, different things, different characteristics that were really evident in the groups that were making aliyah, that were moving to what would later be the State of Israel. And so this was then adopted by the Knesset once the state is founded. This does provide a very broad representation, but that also means that there is a lot of fragmentation within the parliament. That's definitely something that's a main point and a main issue within Israeli politics, and we'll get into that when we talk a little bit more about forming coalitions and the opposition. Now going to a bit more of like just technical issues, but it's good to go over it. Who can vote? So every Israeli citizen aged over 18 can vote. That means that voting rights are directly tied to citizenship, and they are not limited to anything related to religion, ethnicity, gender, or political opinion. If you have a citizenship, you can vote. And according to what is the basic law, as we said, this group of laws that take a sort of constitutional place within Israeli politics, elections must be general, national, direct, equal, secret, and proportional. Most Israeli citizens vote inside of Israel. It's like you have to be in Israel to vote, and that does include occupied territories in the West Bank. They can vote. Israelis can vote from there. Israelis living abroad have to travel to Israel to vote. They can. If you're not living within the Israeli territory, you can come to Israel to vote. There are a few exceptions of people that can vote abroad. So, for example, diplomats, official representatives. So, for example, what are shlichim or shlichot from the Jewish agency, that because of their job are living abroad, they are able to vote from whichever country they're in. And also Israeli sailors, which is always a fun fact that there are voting polls open within Israeli ships. This is just a little bit more in general, but what Israelis vote for. So as we said, Israelis are voting for a list. That means Israel uses what is called a closed list party system. So voters are not choosing individual candidates. They can't choose I'm going to vote for this candidate from one list and a candidate from another list, or change also the order in which candidates are presented in a list. They're voting for the whole list completely. Basically, that means that, for example, if a party gets 5 seats, that means 5 places within the parliament, within the Knesset, the first 5 candidates on their list are the ones to enter. That means if I want to influence who those 5 people are, I have to vote in the internal elections of that party. Once I'm voting for the Knesset, I can't change that order. So therefore, that will depend on the amount of votes that the party receives. If a member of Knesset resigns, that means that they were elected and they got into the Knesset and they resigned from their role, the next person on the list will be the one to take their place. There aren't new elections to decide who will be replacing that person. It's simply based on the party's order within their list. Talking a little bit about how parties determine their list, there isn't a, let's say, a mandatory way to choose an internal list. Most parties do have primary elections. That means that people can be affiliated to a party. Usually we pay like a small amount of money and you are a member legally of that party, and therefore you have the right to vote within the primary, the internal elections. Recently, the Democrat Party with Yair Golan had their primary elections. I think personally that there was an amazing result. You're welcome to then look the results up. We have it on the UPZ Instagram and also on the local UPZ pages. You can look for it to see the results. But basically, whoever is affiliated to a party is entitled to participate in their internal elections. Not all parties have internal elections. Other parties have maybe a committee that chooses who the candidates will be and in what order they will be on the list. Sometimes more religious parties have a religious body that chooses the candidates. That depends on each party's decision or the way they operate. This does create a significant difference within democratic values in the different parties, but that is something that is internal and up to each party's decision. That does mean that also when voters are participating in primary elections and internal elections of the party, they're not only choosing the candidates themselves, but they're also choosing what the party's ideological platform will be, what their program will be, who their leadership will be, because out of the amount of votes that a candidate receives, that will affect their place on the list. So if they'll be number 1 or they'll be number 17. And that obviously affects the chances they have of actually getting afterwards into parliament. And they will be deciding on their complete candidate list and also likely their coalition strategy. So each candidate will have their own political platform, and they'll say, for example, which parties they would be willing to sit in a coalition with within parliament. And so once the primary elections are held, that will also affect how the party will manage its negotiations once in the Knesset, in the parliament. Moving on to election day itself, there is one date held for elections. There will sometimes be some dates prior, especially for diplomats or people voting abroad. But if not, the general public will be voting on one same day, which will be a non-working day, but there will be, of course, public transportation for people to get to their polling booths or the places where they need to vote. The voting is done manually, like it's a paper slip that a person goes to the voting booth. Inside the voting booth, they will go into like a separate room or like a place that has some sort of, let's say, cardboard cover or something, so other people won't see who they're voting for, and they'll see there the different ballots. Usually the ballots, or usually not, the ballots are very simple, different from what happens in many countries where there still is paper elections that have maybe, you know, pictures of the candidates, a bunch of colors, things written, etc. Here in Israel, they're very simple. They're black and white. They only have the party's official name and 2 or 3 letters in Hebrew and Arabic that are the representation of the party's name. Usually before the elections, you'll see the campaigns and the propaganda of the different parties with these slips so their voters can easily identify them on election day. This is done because there are a lot of different demographics within Israel, like ethnic groups, immigrants, etc. People whose maybe their first language isn't Hebrew or Arabic, or it's a bit harder for them to read in those languages. So we try to make it as easy as possible and as identifiable as possible for people to vote. Israel does not use an electronic voting system, basically to avoid cyber attacks, manipulation, fraud from abroad, and just have public confidence in the counting process. There are pros and cons to this. There are countries that do already use an electronic voting system, countries that don't, but up until now in Israel, paper ballots are what are used. There are some special arrangements. I won't go too in depth into these things. There are technical things, and you can look it up on Israel government's page. But just for you know that there is a lot of thought process into the election day, and I think sometimes maybe from the viewpoint of countries where you do have electronic voting, sometimes paper ballots can be seen as something that's a bit out of date or chaotic or not really clear or democratic. But this is really important to know to prove that there is a democratic process and a lot of thought put into the different details that affect a person's position on where they vote or how they vote, etc. So basically, there are special voting arrangements, as I already mentioned, for people living abroad in specific situations. Also for soldiers, so people that are serving in the army currently will have voting booths within their military bases or nearby, and that will be arranged for them to vote. Hospitals, so people that are sick, or medical staff that can't go during the day to vote will have that arranged. Also for prisons, that means also people that are imprisoned, but also staff working there. Diplomatic missions abroad, as I said, Israeli ships, there will be booths within the ship, women's shelters, so there will be booths arranged within the shelter that prevent women from can't or are in risk of leaving their shelter, so that they don't have to leave it, but they can still participate in the democratic process. And of course, accessible polling stations for people with different disabilities and police officers that are on duty during the day. Some voters use something that's called a double envelope. I'll explain that a little bit later, but basically it's especially for police officers that are on duty. They have the possibility to vote at any polling station. If not, you have one that's assigned to you, because that is the place that will check that you're the person that's supposed to vote there and that you're voting only once. They will obviously ask for your ID and proof that you are who you say you are, basically. But police officers that are on duty, because emergencies can happen, are allowed to vote if they're in uniform and on duty in whatever booth is nearest to them at the time. And they will use something called the double envelope, so that later on they can double check that they only voted once and not twice. Anyways, I'll get into it. But as I said, this is just to showcase that there really is a profound and complex process, considering all of the different situations that the country goes through, so people can participate in elections and vote as they need. Yeah, so kind of going into votes to seats. So basically, once the election has been held and the votes has been cast, how is the Knesset formed? How are these votes translated into seats? So as I said, the Knesset has 120 seats. Votes are counted and are divided proportionally based on how many votes a party got. And parties have to pass what is called the electoral threshold. That means that they have to receive at least 3.25% of the national vote. That is approximately 4 seats. Only the votes of the parties that pass this threshold are counted. That means that a party that gets less than 3.25% does not enter the Knesset, does not enter the parliament, and their votes are not counted. Basically, that means that the division is not always exact because the numbers out of that division will not be exact. So a separate calculation is usually needed to allocate and divide surpluses or distributing the remaining seats, and we'll get into how that works. But basically, the final result of the elections or of the allocation of the seats is influenced by the electoral threshold. So if they reach the minimum of 3.25% of the national vote, which parties then therefore qualify and amongst which parties the seats have to be divided. The total number of valid votes, that is, again, only of the votes for the parties that were able to pass the threshold, the batter offer formula that I'll explain in a little bit, and the surplus vote agreement. So as I said, the calculation is never exact. So there are surplus agreements and different systems used to allocate those remaining seats. A little bit on why I don't know why this isn't changing the slide. There we go. So basically why the surplus matters, or why this is so relevant. Basically, this means that a party needs to have or will have a minimum of approximately 4 seats. So that's what the Israeli system views as a minimum to pass into the Knesset. And a party that gets less than 3.25% of the national vote will get 0 seats. They will directly not go into the Knesset. They will not be part of the parliament. The threshold has changed over time. In the beginning, it was just 1%. It went up to 1.5, 2%, etc. But since 2014, it's 3.25. Basically, what the threshold does is that it encourages a lot of times small parties to merge in order to have a better chance of getting into parliament. Parties also form joint electoral lists, that means running together as a joint list. Ideological allies to avoid competing against one another. So maybe smaller parties that have a very similar platform will usually merge together in some way in order to not compete against each other and therefore risk dividing their votes and just not being able to enter the Knesset. Strategic voting, so people will think twice about how they're voting based on what are the main ideas or maybe the main political platform that they want to enter the Knesset, and think about who has a real chance of entering the parliament. And voters will consider basically whether a small party is likely to survive. So if I don't want my vote to be wasted, in a sense, I will think twice who I'm voting for, because if I feel like a small party has no chance at all to even meet the threshold, that means my vote won't count. So I'll think twice before casting it. So basically, what happens when kind of the downside of these votes not being counted means that there is a significant amount of votes that can just go to waste because parties didn't meet the threshold and therefore didn't go into the parliament. And this can really affect later on the negotiations for the Knesset, because that can affect the amount of votes that parties need in order to enter the parliament and therefore form a coalition. This can give a lot of more power to maybe bigger parties because all of those other votes that maybe were going to an alternative ideological platform or less popular ideology will simply not be counted. So it is something that Israeli voters really take into account and think about when they're casting their vote. Okay, so what happens when there is a surplus of votes? So there is a method used within the Israeli parliament called the batter offer method, that in other countries is known as the Dihon system. Basically, what this does is it's a formula that determines which party has the strongest claim to additional seat based on the number of votes it received and therefore the number of seats in the Knesset that it has already received. This method does tend to help the stronger parties because they usually will get some of the surplus votes. It's not an exact formula. There is a lot of nuance that goes into the counting of surplus votes once the elections are finished. But that basically what it means is that the final seats cannot just simply be distributed by the 120 total seats that are within the Knesset. But there is a lot of nuance that goes into who can claim that surplus votes. And besides that, there can also be surplus agreements between two parties. What that means, basically, it doesn't mean that these two parties are running together. It doesn't mean that they necessarily will sit in a coalition together, that they're now bonded in some way. Simply what it means is that they make an internal agreement that has to be presented to the electoral committee before the elections happen, in which if there is a surplus of votes in any of the situations, they will combine them and the total surplus will go to the party who had the most votes. That is a way to ensure that a surplus will go towards a party's, let's say, companion or ideological, or parties that are similarly ideologically will do these agreements to try to ensure that their surplus will go to the benefit of their coalition or their ideology and not simply to the largest party, as we saw with the better offer method. Again, that doesn't mean that the parties have merged. It doesn't mean that they're sharing one platform. It's simply a technical electoral agreement in which my surplus votes can benefit another party that I choose with that agreement. Okay, how is a government formed? So once elections have been held, the votes have been cast, there is already a final and official division of all the 120 seats of the Knesset. Basically, what happens now is that the government has to be formed and the prime minister has to be chosen. That means that winning the largest amount of seats within the Knesset does not automatically give you the role of the prime minister or the lead in the coalition in the government. Basically, what will happen is that the president of the state of Israel will meet with every one of the elected members of Knesset and will consult with them who they recommend to be the prime minister. Obviously, ideologically, parties will have that decided beforehand, but each individual member of Knesset has to answer who they recommend. They can also recommend themselves. And based on these recommendations, the president will assign the most recommended person to be the designated prime minister. This doesn't mean, again, that they're automatically the prime minister. That means that they now have a certain amount of days to form their government. What this means is that they need to prove that they have at least 61 members of Knesset that will support the government that they will present, that this person will present, and support him or her as the prime minister. Usually parties or prime ministers or candidates try to not get just 61, but more, because that means that if you lose the support of a member of Knesset and you're at less than 61, then you're at risk of losing the coalition. Basically, this means that it is often the largest party and the leader of the largest party, but not necessarily. There's no legal bound for that to happen. There's no article within the basic law that says that the party with the most seats in the Knesset is automatically the party that chooses the prime minister. Then what happens is that there are the coalition negotiations. So this person that has been recommended to be the prime minister has to start the negotiations to form their coalition and reach, as I said, at least 61 members of Knesset supporting them. Negotiations can involve different points like distribution of government ministries. So members of Knesset can also serve as ministries. budget commitments, policy agreements, things related to religion and state, the management of military conscription, what we saw with the judicial reform, settlement, social welfare, different ideological points or topics that can be relevant for different parties and that the future or possible prime minister can use to convince members of Knesset to support him. Basically, the proposed government is then presented to the Knesset, and it must obtain approval of the Knesset in order to pass. Of course, if negotiations were done properly and the proposed government has the support of at least 61 or more members of Knesset, the voting should go fine, let's say, and it should be approved. The prime minister designator, the candidate, has 42 days to try and form the government, so to present the government after the negotiations. If that does not happen, they do not succeed, then the president has to reevaluate who the candidate will be and who can actually achieve the parliament majority. A little bit about coalitions and why coalitions are necessary. Basically, as it's written here, no party has ever won 61 seats on its own in an Israeli national election. The closest historically was 56 votes from what was the Alignment Party that later became Avodah, the Labor Party. But basically, no party has ever won 61 seats on its own. Therefore, they wouldn't be able to form a coalition or a government on their own. That means that every Israeli government will always depend on a coalition existing. And also this needs to be ongoing. That means that if at one point during a government's term, they lose this majority of 61 members of Knesset supporting them, then elections might need to be called again. There might be an internal process in the Knesset, etc. But basically, they will always depend on this coalition being strong and maintaining itself throughout the term. Basically, a coalition is a group of political parties that support the government. There's not much to it. Why this affects so much? Why this affects the composition of the Knesset so much? Basically, because it gives an opportunity to smaller parties to be very influential. Because suddenly, a small party that will have at least 4 seats can be crucial to make or break a coalition, and therefore this gives them a lot of leverage to debate conditions, roles within ministries, policies, budget allocations, etc., things that party wants. So also that's important to take into account that when Israelis are voting, they're not only thinking about the fact that their party will be able to enter the Knesset, enter the parliament, but also who they will build a coalition with, because that will favor different ideological platforms. So as I said, this gives small parties a actually really big leverage, even if they have the minimum amount of 4 seats within the parliament. And that also makes that within the Israeli parliament, we will have the coalition. So the group of, or the members of Knesset that are supporting the current government, and we'll have the opposition that are members of Knesset that don't support the current government. That does not mean that the opposition agrees amongst itself as one bloc. They can not support the government or be against the government for different reasons. But that's basically how it's divided between the coalition and the opposition. If for some reason the Knesset is dissolved, it can dissolve itself, as I said, but there's also something called a constructive vote of non-confidence, where the Knesset decides that the coalition has lost confidence or has lost support for its government, and so they can call on the vote of non-confidence, but they need to propose a new prime minister and a new government to take its place. That also needs to have at least 61 members of Knesset supporting it. This is to prevent people to simply overhauling the government or taking it down, but to actually propose an option that does have the confidence or the support necessary. Going into why the system is so complex, and I think a lot of it maybe is evident because of the things that we've gone through, but basically, as we saw, the Israeli political system is taken from the issue from a time prior to the creation of the state, and this means that there is, it's made to represent a lot of small communities and ideologies, which on the one hand can be very positive, But that means that the political map is very complex. It's not as simple as left and right, or maybe only measured through an economical point of view, as maybe it happens in a lot of countries. There are many different topics that influence a party's position, things like security and diplomacy, religion and state, Jewish-Arab relations, economy and social policy, settlements and occupation, democracy and the judiciary system, Haredi, Orthodox military conscription, national identity. And the electoral system allows many of these voices to be represented because as we saw, one list can have different candidates that represent different ideologies or different subgroups or different ethnicities, etc. But also within a coalition in the government, you can have very different parties, even small parties making a big impact. So this creates a system in which there can be a lot of contradictions also within a coalition, and where one party can be maybe very conservative on its view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but still very liberal in things that have to do with social issues. So that makes a very complex composition of the different parties and of coalitions itself. Again, you can be very right-wing when it comes to security, but still be very secular on what has to do with religion. It can be economically conservative, but very liberal on social issues. It can be Arab-led, but still willing to participate in a Zionist coalition, or it can be a Jewish Arab and socialist party, but not a Zionist one. Therefore, these are different points that will influence when trying to build a coalition within the government, or when trying also to agree on different points within a coalition in the government. There are not little example, like not a small amount of examples in Israeli history where coalitions have been broken or have been on the verge of being dissolved because within a coalition there are very contradictory viewpoints on different issues. A good example is currently with the issue of Orthodox military conscription. There are very right-wing parties that still think that Orthodox people should serve, and very right-wing parties that do not think that Orthodox people should serve. So that really creates a complex system within the coalitions. Going on to the next slide. Again, this is also why it is often unstable, basically because a coalition can very easily lose majority, parties leave the government, a budget is not able to be passed because they don't agree on how it should be distributed. Each year, the budget is passed within the Knesset. They have until March 31st, if I'm not mistaken, to pass the budget once the fiscal year begins. And if the government does not manage to pass it, then it can also be dissolved. And again, coalition partners disagreeing on major issues, or small parties that gain leverage over the government and therefore change the ideological platform of a coalition. There was a, let's say, experiment to try to separate this system a little bit and make it less unstable, which was a direct election of prime minister. Basically what that meant is that an Israeli citizen would vote for a list for the Knesset, for the parliament, and separately they would vote on a candidate for the prime minister, even if the candidate was part of the same party they voted for in the Knesset or not. It was tried in 1996, and 1999, and 2001, but eventually was abandoned because it did not help. It actually made things even more unstable because that meant that a prime minister did not necessarily have support within the parliament. And when it's just a one-chamber system, it was very difficult to sustain a government and make it work. That's a little bit about why the system sometimes seems very unstable. A little bit about the 2026 elections pretty quickly. Basically, the elections for the 26th Knesset will be held on October 27th of 2026. September 9th, candidate lists will be submitted after parties have their internal processes to choose that list. Again, some of them might be primary elections, others will be chosen by some sort of committee. October 20th will be the voting and diplomatic missions, so people that are abroad and have permission to vote from different countries. October 27th is the official election day for the general public. And November 4th, the official results are confirmed. Once that happens, the whole process that we went over will begin. Basically, the president will sit with a member of Knesset. He will decide who the candidate for the prime minister will be, and the negotiations will begin. And basically, it is a very critical election because what will be determined is the coalition who will either continue the 37th government led by Benjamin Netanyahu or change the course of Israeli politics. Basically, I'm not going to go into this too much because the next session will be a little bit about the context of the 2026 elections. But as we all know, we come from very intense years in Israel, not only with the ongoing war that began on October 7th, but also beforehand with the judicial overhaul, a lot of protests, a lot of instability within the country and the government. And there are a lot of things that are going into, or they're at play with these elections that can really change the way we look at Israeli politics. It can really change the way that the country is managed and formed. Again, I think in the second session, you'll go a little bit more into this, but in general, these are main points that affect the elections context. Mainly, I think the future of Israeli democracy, and as we talked about, the separation between the Supreme Court, the Knesset, the government, and the basic laws and how they are defined and how they are ruled, basically. And we'll go into the main voting options. I'm not going to go into possible coalitions and stuff like that because the polls will be analyzed in the third meeting. But I will talk about a little bit about the general parties that there are that have, at least until now, been confirmed or say they will be running in the elections. I really recommend looking into the Israeli Institute for Democracy's webpage if you want to learn more about the different parties, their history, their stances on a bunch of different topics. It's a very good and very interactive page, but we'll talk about just general things here. Basically, in what is the right and pro-Netanyahu bloc, we have parties like Likud, Shas, United Torah Judaism, Religious Zionist Party, and Otzma Yehudit. In the center positioned parties in anti-Netanyahu opposition, we have Together, Beyachad, Yashar, Blue and White, and Israel Beitenu. In the left progressive Zionist camp, we have the Democrats. And then we have the Arab or non-Zionist parties, where we have parties like Hadash, Tal, Balad, Ram, and Makom Lekulanu. I'll just go pretty quick into the different parties, but the Likud, that I assume we all know pretty well, is led by Benjamin Netanyahu, national liberal right-wing party, very Jewish nationalist, strong security-oriented policies, a management of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, traditional Jewish identity, a lot of support for what is individual freedoms or what is a neoliberal sense of the economy. They have shown in the past some pragmatism with territorial agreements, but again, they have been the party or Bibi himself has been pretty flexible with his policies on the conflict and territorial issues, specifically when it comes to building coalitions. We have the Shas party, which is led by Aryeh Deri, which is a Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party that was founded basically by Mizrahi Sephardic communities that felt underrepresented with the Ashkenazi Haredim, with the Orthodox community. So there is a very specific ethnic or demographic group that votes for Shas. They are a very welfare-oriented party, which sometimes can sound a bit strange because they are very religious and very conservative in that sense. But as we talked about, Israeli parties can't really be defined by just one name or aren't so black and white. So they do have a very strong welfare stance, but they still are very conservative. They defend religious education and just interest of traditional Orthodox voters. Then we have United Torah Judaism with Moshe Gafni and Yitzhak Goldknopf, which is a joint list from what was the Ashkenazi Haredi Party and Agudat Israel and Degel HaTorah. They defend, again, welfare, Haredi education, religious institutions, military service exemptions, which is a very important point in these upcoming elections, and just preserving the religious character of the state in general. Within that, we also have the more extreme right-wing religious parties, which is the Religious Zionist Party led by Bezalel Smotrich, and Otzma Yehudit, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Both of them are very extreme religious right-wing parties that have very strong stances on what has to do with sovereignty in the West Bank or the occupied territories and building what is known as the Greater Land of Israel, limiting the authority of the Supreme Court. So really kind of blurring the lines between the division of the different democratic or governmental bodies within the state of Israel, harsher policies against Palestinians, open fire regulations for security forces, much easier access to gun importation for civil citizens, etc. Then we go into what is the center right-wing secular parties. We have Together B'Yachad, which was announced this year, which is a joint list between Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. So Bennett's new party, which is called Bennett 2026, and Yesh Atid, which is the party that Yair Lapid has been leading for some years now. They have cooperated previously in the government. And this is a pretty strong list from what the polls have been showing. We have Yashar with Gadi Eisenkot. Gadi Eisenkot was a former IDF chief of staff, and he's become a very strong anti-Netanyahu figure within in the last couple of months. And his goal is preserving Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, strengthening national security, pursuing regional cooperation, promoting public education, which is a very important topic within the Israeli society, how educational curriculum is built in different schools, including religious schools, and national military service for all. That, as I said, is a very hot topic in these elections. We have Blue and White with Benny Gantz, a party that has been in the run for a while now. Again, another strong opposition party, led by Benny Gantz, who has been also part of previous governments. It's one of the opposition platforms for 2026, but they still haven't really published a specific political platform for this year. And then you have Israel Beiteinu, which is led by Avigdor Lieberman. It's a secular right-wing party. It was originally associated with a lot of immigrants from what was the Soviet Union, and Lieberman really rose to fame defending or representing that group's interests. They have very strong security positions and diplomatic positions, but still very secular positions on the division between religion and state. Really defend what is private enterprise and a very liberal economy, but replacing a parliamentary system with a presidential model, which is not a small detail to avoid. Then within the left-wing Zionist parties, we have the Democrats led by Yair Golan, which is basically the combination of the parties of Meretz and Labor that was formed a couple of years ago, but basically now has been confirmed with its first primary elections. That again, you can look at our Instagram page to see the results. But basically, it is today the only left-wing Zionist option. And it has built its political platform supporting the rule of democratic institutions, the separation between religion and state, LGBTQA plus freedom, women's right, opposing annexation, against the occupation, equal military service, civil marriage, public transportation on Shabbat, stronger public services within the Israeli state, an educational curriculum that is the same for all types of schools, etc. But basically a much more liberal and progressive state that is mainly democratic and is basically the most left-wing option within the Zionist parties that exist today. We then have the Arab and non-Zionist parties. We have Hadash, which is a Jewish Arab socialist or communist-oriented party, supports a two-state solution. Sorry that I forgot to mention that also the Democrats support a two-state solution and to the occupation, an equality basically between Jewish and Arab citizens, and a very strong viewpoint on social justice and workers' rights as a proper left-wing party. Then we have Tal, which is led by Ahmed Tibi. It's a secular Arab party that also supports an Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the establishment of a Palestinian state, and focuses a lot on civil equality and reducing economic, educational, and social gaps between Arab and Jewish citizens. We have a Balad with Sami Abu Shadeh, which is also another Palestinian Arab nationalist party, which wants Israel to be transformed into a state of all its citizens and advocates for Palestinian statehood, against, again, the occupation and recognition of Arab citizens as a national minority, preservation of the Palestinian Arab cultural identity, and the return of Palestinian refugees, along with the separation of religion and state, of course, by transforming Israel into a state for all of its citizens. Then we have LAM, which is known as United Arab List under Mansour Abbas, which is an Islamist Arab party that has participated in the coalition supporting the previous Bennett-Lapid government, advocates for the recognition of Arab citizens as a national minority, and a lot of improvement related to welfare and the development of Arab communities, Palestinian statehood, against the settlements and the occupation, and addressing the Palestinian issue with prisoners and refugees. And finally, we have what I think is the newest party, which is called Makom Lekulano, or Place for All, led by Alan Ligri and Rula Daoud. It's the party that was formed from the movement Standing Together, or Omdim Beyachad. They haven't fully confirmed their participation in the Knesset in the elections for 2026, as they want to see if they actually have a chance of passing the threshold, as to not throw their votes away. But it is a new Jewish and Arab party led by Alon and Rula. It's built around equal Jewish and Arab representation, gender representation, and they really emphasize issues as peace, ending the occupation, economic equality, supporting Arab communities, and just participating in a future. And they did say that they are open to participate in a future center-left coalition. So that's basically our presentation in general. I hope I didn't rush too much through the information. Again, as I said, if you want to learn more in depth about the parties and their platforms, I really recommend the page of the Israel's Institute for Democracy. It's really good and very interactive. And yeah, and we can go into questions or maybe points that weren't as clear that we can go over.
Amazing, Nadu. Thank you very much. Wait, just 1 second. Okay, you can breathe, you can drink some water. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And we do have some questions before I read them. Just a reminder, you can send it to me. I'll show up as the moderator on the chat or in the general chat if you want any questions, and we'll do our best to read as many as we can to challenge Nadu in her knowledge of the Israeli political system. So we have some questions from around the world. So far, I'm condensing a few that are very similar, and I'll start maybe with the more simpler ones before we move over to the more challenging ones. Michelle from Chile asks if political parties have any law regarding gender quotas. For those of you who don't know, this means, for example, a mandatory minimum of women or non-male identities as part of the list that they should present for candidates.
Okay. No, there isn't a specific quota, at least not that I know of, refraining or limiting the formation of political parties. It is on the platform of some of the parties, especially the left-wing ones, not just for Knesset members, but in general to ensure gender equality, but there isn't something specific for the lists.
Right. I told you that would be an easy one. Moving over to another relatively simple one, I think. Maurizio from Rome, from Italy, is asking if you can explain to us the position of the more relevant opposition parties regarding the two-state solution.
Okay, there are, I'd say, at least from my knowledge, and also I think that will be something maybe for the second and third sessions, not all parties have a 100% defined position on the conflict, or maybe what the solution is actually properly. There are different positions or more clear positions on how the conflict should be managed, or let's say if it should be managed or a solution should be found. at least to my knowledge, most of the parties that do have an explicit position that I went through now are the left-wing ones. Sorry, maybe the more extreme are the ones that are on the ends of the spectrum. So we do have the more extreme right-wing religious parties that do not support a Palestinian state in any shape or form, and even support a wider expansion of the Israeli state, or what is known as the Greater State of Israel. And then on the other end, we have, I'd say, from the Democrats and towards the left, support for mostly a two-state solution. How those two states would look depends even sometimes on the candidates individually, but they do in general support a two-state solution. Specifically, if I'm not mistaken, it's Iran. Sorry that I sometimes confuse the smaller Arab parties. I just don't want to say something that's wrong. Balad, sorry, which is one of the smaller Arab parties that sometimes go together in a joint list, do support turning Israel into, as I said, a state of all its citizens. So a completely separate situation of religion and state, in which Israel is a secular state for all of its citizens. Within the more center parties, it depends a little bit on each candidate sometimes, or maybe they don't have just one party position on what the solution would be, just maybe a bit stronger or more flexible positions regarding negotiation of territories, military intervention, and managing the security situation in general.
Great, thank you, Nadu. Moving on with the next few questions. Lawrence from London, from England, asks your opinion regarding the possibility of changing the electoral system towards a district-based system that is not making the whole country one electoral district and moving over to a system that is more similar, for example, to the UK or most representative democracies where districts choose one or a number of representatives. Do you think this would change things positively, or would it have, according to your view, a negative impact on democracy?
I have to say this is my opinion, and I'm not an expert political analyst. I'm not sure if that would work for Israel or the state of Israel currently, because there is such big differences between what is known as the periphery of the state and the more densely populated regions, which are usually in the center of the state. That doesn't mean that the periphery have less people living in them necessarily, but I think that there are very big demographical differences on what communities are allocated where throughout the country, and I think that would really affect representation. Let's say I don't know, it's a difficult question, honestly, because it's very analytical, but I think because of how the state of Israel was developed, specific populations were placed strategically throughout the map. So if we're going to go south or north to the periphery, we'll find usually more Mizrahi communities that were placed there kind of as buffers when the state was founded towards the Arab communities that were already there. So it will really affect, I think, the results of the elections. And I wouldn't see it as maybe a positive change, because it would just create a lot of more fragmentation that there already is. And maybe also underrepresentation of smaller ethnical groups or just minorities that live within, zones that are like categorized as, for example, more Mizrahi or Arab villages, or Arabs living within more Jewish cities that would just underrepresent them, I believe. But again, it's my opinion. I'm not a political analyst, so take it with care.
For example, the voice of a secular woman from Jerusalem, because you are a minority.
Yeah.
The same way, for example, in the US with the Electoral College is a little different, but for example, the voice of conservatives in a democratic state or liberals in a Republican state. Thank you, Nadu. We have a few more questions, and remember, you can send more in the chat. Pablo, our compatriot from Buenos Aires, asks if you can explain a bit about the differences between the different parties that are located in the center of the political spectrum.
Yeah. So I think usually kind of like the main differences will go on. I think one of the main issues that today defines a party within the Israeli political system is their view on the conflict. So I think that will usually be like a main differential for the different parties. And also what the background of the candidates or their leaders or their head of the list is representing. Basically, as I said, we have Beyachad, which is the party of Bennett and Yair Lapid. I think it is important to say that if we look at Bennett and Lapid's trajectory within politics, they are very different. I mean, Bennett did also participate in much more conservative governments, and I think in the past has had very conservative positions, also in things regarding education, for example, and security. And throughout the years has become, I don't know if he's changed his opinion, but has become at least more flexible within his positions and who he's sitting with. And Lapid with Yesh Atid also has, let's say, flirted with more left-wing or right-wing positions, depending on the coalition they're sitting at. So I think it is a party that will bring together a very general, like average Israeli voice that are concerned with the situation regarding the conflict and that maybe don't agree with the very strong militarized position that is currently going on in the government, but are still right-wing voters or conservative voters in general. And maybe their main issue is to have a more democratic or more balanced position towards the conflict, not necessarily people that vote in favor of every single peace process or that are open to negotiating every single territorial aspect, but that do believe that there needs to be a more mild position regarding the conflict, but are still like right-wing traditional voters. Gadi Eisenkot, I think, is a figure that is rising very, very strong now, specifically with what has to do with military service for all, which, as I said, is a very hot topic in these elections, I think more than it was in the past. And because his history as being the chief of staff of the IDF and his knowledge on national security and on the Israeli Defense Forces, people whose number one issue is that Orthodox people be recruited to the army will be voting for him. And also still very, like, I'd say, traditional defenders of a democratic state. He has spoken a lot about promoting public education and basically having an educational curriculum that every single school has to respect. That means that today there are a lot of Orthodox schools that, you know, don't teach math, science, or don't teach it to all of its students, especially not to men who are studying, or to boys who are studying Torah. And that has also been a really strong point on his agenda. But I think for the voters who, you know, the recruitment to the army is like their number one issue, that's a very strong option for them. We have Benny Gantz. Again, I'm not necessarily a political analyst, but I think Benny Gantz might not be the strongest party within the center because there hasn't been any new proposals from his side. Like, his official platform still hasn't been published. It is, again, a traditional right-wing vote. He was also an IDF chief of staff, which was kind of his strong point up until now, his knowledge of the security situation and national security and the conflict. I think now with Gadi Eisenkot in the picture being a very strong, like, refreshed image, I think Benny Gantz might be a bit weaker because they do share a lot of the points on why their voters would have supported them. But he also defends, you know, recruitment for all and a more traditional, still right-wing management of the economy, but public education and democratic values. And then you have Israel Beiteinu with Lieberman that I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think in general his, like, voter population doesn't change too much. Again, he really represents what is the former Soviet Union group, or they're not really a minority, honestly, but like that demographic, and very strong positions regarding the, like, national security and the conflict, but still very secular, which I think is a big difference when we look at other right-wing parties that maybe do have a strong vision on the militarization of the conflict and security and are very strict on that side, but are still either very religious or are prepared to sit with religious parties in a coalition. Lieberman isn't, or is much more defensive of his secular viewpoints. Yeah, I hope that was a bit clear. But again, I really recommend looking into each issue of the different parties because small nuances can be big differences when looking at Israeli political parties.
Thank you, Nado. And we have questions. One of them comes from Ciro from Sao Paulo, Brazil. He asks, and I'll be reading it in Portuguese, if there are laws that bar a specific party from running for elections, for example, if they espouse supremacist or racist views, and if it's possible, if you know, to impeach or remove parliament members in case they exhibit that type of views.
So first of all, yes. I mean, there is the Israeli Electoral Committee where a list has to be presented and it has to be approved by this committee. And there are different points that will stop a party from being accepted. I'm trying to find it because I have it written down just to make sure that I don't forget anything. Here it is. But a party or a candidate can be disqualified for three main points. One is rejecting Israel's existence as a Jewish and democratic state, meaning it can be also against the Jewish part or against the democratic part, inciting racism, and supporting armed struggle by any enemy of the state of Israel or any terrorist organization against Israel. Those are the three main points that the Central Election Committee can disqualify a candidate or a party. And the decisions of the committee, if they choose to disqualify, they think someone should be disqualified, have to be reviewed by the Supreme Court. So many times the Supreme Court have stopped motions to disqualify, for example, Arab parties under false pretenses. But those are the three main points that they are pretty, I'd say, broad. So each case is reviewed by the election committee and afterwards by the Supreme Court.
Great, thank you. And we have another question from David from England. If you can talk about voter intimidation, the possibilities of voter intimidation or any kind of measures aimed at discouraging specific demographics from voting, if you know that there are ways to protect this, and if it's possible to record people as they are voting as a way of discouraging the vote.
So first of all, no, I mean, it's illegal to record a person while they're voting, and the person has to enter the voting booth or the voting room alone, and the final vote is a secret, exactly to prevent voter intimidation, as I think we can find in many other electoral systems around the world. Of course, a lot of voter intimidation can still exist. I think also when we see that Israel is a state that has a combination of a very liberal, democratic, Western structure, but within the state, we have a lot of more what is called tribal organized cities or populations, etc., then a lot of intimidation can happen that way. I think in general, there are maybe populations that are less encouraged to go and vote, not even talking about who they're voting for, but to assist and take part in the elections. It's important to know that voting in Israel isn't mandatory, and so they're less encouraged to go and participate. I think we can see that as examples in the female Arab population, the female Jewish Orthodox population, not only through, I think, intimidation itself during the elections, but I think also when we talk about differences in access to education and access to critical thinking, a bunch of different things that we know really affect a person's possibility to think for themselves and go and participate in a democratic process. The system itself is built to prevent these things. Like the person will enter on their own to vote. You're not allowed to record a person. Anyone has the right to not say who they voted for, or of course lie, for example. So the system itself is built to prevent it, but of course, in a country that has so many disparities, that is something that exists. But I think it's not just in Israel. I think in general, when we talk about disparities in the world, that also affects democratic elections.
Great. And the last question, and before you answer it, I just want to remind everyone that we will be meeting again. So in case your questions we didn't have time for them, we will meet twice for the next 2 Sundays. The next session will be with José Sassón from Mexico and Naamá Moshinsky from Israel. We'll talk about the main issues surrounding the 2026 Israeli elections. So thank you all for connecting and sending your questions. And Nadu, thank you. And before everybody moves on to enjoy the rest of your Sunday or your night, just a reminder that where Nadia is in Jerusalem, it's currently 10:23 p.m. So thank you double for your time this late at night. Vincent from France asks if you could tell us about some of the parties that are struggling with the 3.25% electoral threshold, the minimum, if you know if there are talks about mergers or possible dropouts for this election.
Yeah, so I think that currently is specifically leading regarding Arab and non-Zionist parties. There is a big possibility of Hadash, Tal, and Balad, that are three of the Arab parties, of running together as a joint list, which is something that they have done in the past. Tal and Balad usually run together, and Hadash depends on their numbers for that year, who they're running with. There has been talk, at least from what I've heard, of the three of them running together to be able to pass the threshold. And as I said, Makom Lekulanu, which is the party of standing together, Omdim Beyachad, have said that they will only run if they are certain that they are able to pass the threshold, which will depend on the polls and internal analysis, I guess, of the situation, because obviously until the elections are through, there's no way of knowing 100%, but they have said that if there is any doubt of them not being able to pass the threshold, they won't run, because that means that their voters will be significant voices that will not be counted within the final results, and that can really strengthen right-wing parties. From the right-wing parties, at least to my knowledge, there hasn't been a discussion of specific parties not being able to pass the threshold. There are different parties that in the past have already merged into a joint list or a joint party, like I mentioned. Like, for example, United Torah Judaism is the union of Agudat Israel and Degel Torah, and they're supposed to continue with the party itself. Yeah, I think, at least to my knowledge, up until now, I haven't heard of other specific parties thinking of merging or not being able to pass the threshold. But I think in the last encounter with Ron, analyzing the polls, there will definitely be more nuances and details into that question.
Amazing. With that said, we have a lot looking forward for the next few sessions. Remember, it's at this time. We will be sharing the recording in case you were able to connect a bit late, or if you would like to share it with somebody else who wasn't able to be here. And also remind people that they are welcome, even though they haven't been here today, they're welcome to join this online seminar that we're conducting from the World Union of Progressive Zionists, since each session stands on its own, and we'll be talking about different topics regarding the election. So thank you all for connecting, and special thanks to Nadia Rogovsky, who gave such a wonderful explanation about the upcoming elections from Jerusalem. We will be doing more activities related to this, so stay in touch, and remember to follow your local UPZ affiliate. In most of the countries, it's called Meretz, but different names in different countries. For example, for Partners for Progressive Israel in the US, Centro Progresista Judío in Chile, and different names for different countries. We can also send you the link. So keep in touch, and thank you all for joining us.